Romário had been saying he would only return if Brazil needed him. By September 1993, Brazil needed him badly enough for the whole country to know it. That is the part that still gives the story its charge. Not just that Romário came back, not just that he scored, but that he returned after Brazil had tried to keep moving without him, and that attempt had started to look less convincing with every anxious step toward the World Cup. The match was against Uruguay at the Maracanã. For Brazil, it was the last game of the qualifiers for the 1994 World Cup. A draw would be enough, but that did not remove the pressure. It almost made it worse. Brazil was not supposed to arrive at the final day of qualification carrying this kind of discomfort. It was not supposed to look at a World Cup place as something still needing to be secured. And yet, there it was. The yellow shirt, the Maracanã, Uruguay across the field, and Romário back in the middle of a national argument that had grown too loud to ignore. This was no longer only a selection debate. It was something people could feel before kickoff. The sense that the national team was carrying a problem it had created for itself. For viewers who come to this story through the 1994 World Cup, Romário can seem inevitable. He is the sharp little striker at the center of Brazil's attack, the player who gives a cautious team its edge, the star who finishes the tournament with the authority of someone who had always belonged there. But winning has a way of making everything behind it look cleaner than it was. Before the trophy, before the images from the United States, before Romário became the obvious face of that Brazilian attack, there had been doubt, resistance, and a long attempt to prove that Brazil could solve its problems without him. That attempt is where the story really begins. Romário was never only a question of ability. No serious observer needed much time to see what he could do. He was quick in the box, ruthless in small spaces, and unusually calm where most forwards became hurried. He did not need many touches. He did not need to look involved for long stretches. He could drift near the edge of a match and then decide it with the first clear opening. That made him dangerous. It also made him difficult to judge by the usual signs of obedience. Playing for the national team is about more than goals. It means accepting the weight of the shirt, the rhythm of the group, and the authority of the coach. Brazil's shirt carries freedom in the imagination, but the team itself has always depended on control. Who is selected? Who is trusted? Who is allowed to be different? And how much difference the group can carry. Romário did not fit that order easily. He was not the kind of player who made authority comfortable. He could sound blunt. He could seem detached. He did not always perform the public rituals of humility that make institutions more willing to forgive talent. With Romário, there was always the feeling that he knew exactly what he was worth, and that he did not feel obliged to hide it. For a coach, that matters, especially for Carlos Alberto Parreira, who was trying to build a Brazil that would not fall apart under the weight of its own mythology. In a short international tournament, control is not only tactical, it is also a way of keeping a temporary group together before pressure turns every difference into a possible fracture. Brazil had spent years carrying the memory of gifted teams that had not won the World Cup. By the early 1990s, Parreira was trying to build a side that could survive pressure, not just express talent. In that kind of team, Romário was not an easy question. He offered exactly what Brazil lacked near goal, but he also forced the system to decide how much difference it could tolerate. Parreira's Brazil was not built to entertain first. It was built to endure. That is why reducing the story to Romário against Parreira makes it too small. Parreira was not simply standing in the way of genius. He was trying to protect a team from becoming hostage to instability. He wanted a side that could defend, repeat movements, manage risk, and move through a tournament without needing every match to become an act of inspiration. The problem was that a team still has to score. That is where Romário kept returning to the conversation, even when he was absent from the field. Brazil could talk about discipline, it could talk about balance, it could talk about the collective. But each time the attack looked blunt, each time the final action was missing, the argument became harder to hold in place. Because Romário's gift was painfully specific. He gave a team something that could not be created by shape alone. He was not a forward who needed Brazil to abandon caution and open the match completely. He did not need 20 attacks to feel present. He needed one hesitation from a defender, one ball played across the area, one moment when the match stopped being organized and became instinctive. In that instant, his value was obvious in a way that press conferences could not easily erase. During qualification, Brazil's discomfort made his absence visible. That is the danger of leaving out a player everyone knows can decide a match. At first, absence can be explained. The coach has a plan. The group has standards. The shirt demands certain things. But if the team struggles, absence starts to change shape. It becomes less like discipline and more like denial. Romário was no longer just a forward outside the squad. He became the answer people could point to every time Brazil lacked clarity near goal. For the fans, the selection debate was not an internal football department issue. It was the missed chance, the slow attack, the feeling that everyone could see the same problem except the people responsible for solving it. Once the same absence is felt in the stands and on the pitch, selection stops being a private decision. It becomes something the match itself keeps testing. That is how pressure gathers. By the time Brazil faced Uruguay, Romário's return did not feel like a normal adjustment. It felt like a concession to the evidence. The stadium understood that. The country understood it too. Brazil was still Brazil, but it was a Brazil forced into an uncomfortable position, needing a player who had been treated as a problem. The first goal came in the first half. Jorginho crossed from the right, and Romário moved between defenders with that familiar economy, arriving as if the space had been waiting for him. His header was not theatrical. It did not need to be. The ball went in, and the Maracanã released something larger than celebration. Brazil had not only taken the lead, the argument had changed. Later, in the second half, he scored again. This time, the ball arrived from the left, and Romário finished close to goal. The kind of finish that looks simple only because the hard part happened before the touch. Brazil beat Uruguay 2-0. Brazil qualified. On paper, it was a forward doing his job in an important match. In memory, it became something sharper. Romário had been brought back under pressure, and the match made the pressure look justified. That is the danger for any institution. It can survive disagreement. It can survive criticism. What it struggles to survive is the moment when the person it resisted gives the clearest answer on the field. After that night, Romário was not merely selected. He had become difficult to exclude. And still, the next part of the story is not that he defeated the system. That would be too easy and not quite true. Brazil did not go to the 1994 World Cup as a team remade in Romário's image. It did not suddenly become loose, indulgent, or romantic. Parreira's side remained careful, Dunga and Mauro Silva gave the midfield weight. The defense was protected. Risk was managed. The team did not need Romário to make the system disappear. It needed him to give the system an ending. Romário entered that structure, and this is what makes the story more interesting. He did not have to destroy it in order to matter. He made the structure usable. In the United States, the earlier argument did not disappear. It became visible in a different form. Brazil did not need Romário to touch every passage of play or make every match expressive. It needed him to make limited moments count. Bebeto's movement helped. His intelligence and willingness to connect the play prevented Romário from becoming isolated as a lone solution. But Romário's value remained painfully specific. A cautious team does not always give its striker abundance. It gives him fragments. A cross, a rebound, a defender caught square, a narrow lane between bodies. Some forwards need rhythm to grow into a match. Romário could live from scraps and still make the match feel as though it had been waiting for him. Against Russia, he scored. Against Cameroon, he scored. Against the Netherlands, in one of Brazil's most open and dangerous matches of the tournament, he scored again. Against Sweden in the semi-final, he found the goal that carried Brazil to the final. None of this felt accidental, but it also did not feel like the old fantasy of Brazil, simply overwhelming the world with endless attacking freedom. The goals came inside a more controlled bargain. Brazil would not give the game everything. It would give Romário enough. That bargain is easy to miss because Romário's individual memory is so strong. The finishes remain. The swagger remains. The image of the small forward deciding large matches remains. But underneath that memory is a more uncomfortable dependency. Brazil had built a team around control and still needed one player who could make control productive near goal. That is why the 1994 World Cup should not be treated as the whole subject. It is the confirmation. The real transformation had already happened before the tournament, when Brazil's attempt to move without Romário became harder and harder to justify. The trophy made the story cleaner. It pushed the earlier conflict into the background. It made the late return look like destiny. Once Brazil became world champion, Romário's place in the team seemed obvious, almost natural. But it had not been natural. It had been negotiated through pressure, through results, through public unease, and finally, through goals that left little room for argument. There is a difference between being chosen and becoming unavoidable. Romário's place in Brazilian football memory often rests on personality. The confidence, the bluntness, the refusal to shrink. Those things matter because they shaped how people saw him. But the deeper story is not simply that he was difficult. It is that his difficulty became survivable once Brazil realized the alternative was less convincing. That is a very different kind of power. It was not the power to stand above Brazil. No player stands above that shirt for long. It was the power to expose a need. Brazil could insist on order, but order alone could not finish the move. Brazil could protect the collective, but the collective still needed someone capable of deciding the moment when structure ran out. Romário gave Parreira's Brazil a controlled rupture, something that did not fully belong to the system, but made the system more complete. That is why his story should not be flattened into rebellion. Romário did not win because discipline failed. Parreira did not win because individuality was suppressed. The team won because those forces, uncomfortable as they were together, found a temporary arrangement. Parreira's system gave Romário a foundation. Romário gave the team something no coach can simply drill into existence. And then, victory made it look simple. By the end, the images belonged to the World Cup. Romário celebrating, Romário smiling, Romário with the trophy, Romário remembered as the star of Brazil's 4th title. Those images are true. They are just not the whole story. Before them, there is the Maracanã. There is the pressure of a qualifying campaign that should not have felt so fragile. There is a coach trying to preserve authority. There is a player whose absence became louder than many players' presence. There was a country slowly losing patience with the idea that Brazil could solve the problem without him. That is where Romário became more than a selection choice. He became the player Brazil could not afford to exclude, not because he was easy, not because he fit perfectly, not because he made the system disappear, because Brazil reached the point where keeping him outside created a bigger problem than bringing him in. And once that happened, the exception was no longer outside the order. It had become one of the conditions that allowed the order to survive.